Released in the United States and Europe in the summer of 2000, Perfect Dark is a first-person shooter game developed and published by Rare for the Nintendo 64, continuing their fruitful partnership with Nintendo during the late 90s after releasing the earlier groundbreaking first-person shooter GoldenEye 007, as well as the fan-favorite action platformer games Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. When it initially began development, Perfect Dark was actually Rare's concept for a GoldenEye sequel before being outbid for the license by Electronic Arts. However, Rare was more than satisfied with their time spent in the James Bond universe and now preferred to explore more mature science fiction concepts. The inclusion and focus on alien races in a sci-fi world was heavily inspired by the X-Files TV show. Other influences from external media included the Ghost in the Shell manga, the 1982 film Blade Runner, and the postmodernist writings of Philip K. Dick. While production of Perfect Dark began using the same engine as GoldenEye, only about 30% of the original programming remained after being thoroughly upgraded to include larger environments, more textures, and real-time lighting. As was the case with most of the games released in the later half of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, Perfect Dark heavily utilized the N64 expansion pack for expanded gameplay features and higher visual detail. Development of Perfect Dark took nearly 3 years, the first half of which was supposedly quite unsatisfactory, leading to the departure of nearly half of the game's development team, including director Martin Hollis. Rare then increased the size of the team with new members until it was roughly 3 times the size of the team responsible for GoldenEye 007. After this, without the stress of deadlines or schedules, and even without a project manager, individual members of the team would contribute to the project with whatever they thought was cool and would work with the originally conceived story and ideas. We'll come to see how all of their individual ideas turned into something remarkable as we consider what's so great about Perfect Dark. Set in an alternate universe in the futuristic year of 2023, Perfect Dark focuses on the climactic events of an interstellar war between 2 alien races known as the Mayans and the Skedar. Also featured in this narrative are 2 rival human companies, the Carrington Institute, who are in league with the gray archetypal Mayan aliens, and the antagonistic Datadyne, who have agreed to help the reptilian Skedar aliens unearth an ancient and powerful alien ship in exchange for technology that will allow them to become the largest corporation on Earth. As the game begins, players find themselves in the shoes of Agent Joanna Dark of the Carrington Institute as she attempts to extract a defector from their rival Datadyne Corporation. At the time of Perfect Dark's conception, director Martin Hollis believed that there should be more video games starring women, and to that extent the team at Rare created Joanna, inspired by many other female protagonists including Dana Scully from X-Files, as well as the titular character from 1990 French thriller film La Femme Nikita. Joanna's name was also inspired by the French pronunciation for Joan of Arc. Following in the footsteps of GoldenEye 007 for the same console, Perfect Dark is also considered as a first-person spy shooter, focusing less on run-and-gun action than many of its contemporaries, and more on meticulous, objective-based gameplay. Just as in GoldenEye, each level of the solo campaign can be played on one of 3 difficulties, each with an increasing number of objectives, alongside increased enemy health, damage, and attention spans. If the player is ever confused as to what each of their objectives actually entails, then a more detailed briefing can be accessed from the pause menu, which elaborates a bit more on the locations and characters that a player should look out for, as well as the uses of some level-specific equipment. One particularly impressive piece of technology in Joanna's arsenal is the Cam Spy, which is a small robotic camera which floats as its own entity completely independent of Joanna. In fact, our protagonist and her futuristic drone can actually see each other in real 3D space, and can switch focus back and forth as desired. The Cam Spy can move virtually as freely as Joanna herself, being able to float at 3 different heights, strafe, and even open doors on its own. Many objectives in each level of the solo campaign can be completed in whichever order the player sees fit, supposing one objective doesn't grant access to another explicitly. With the completion of each stage within a certain time, the player will be granted a variety of cheats which can be enabled from the main menu for use in both solo and multiplayer gameplay. The cheats range from aesthetic-only categories to ones that change the gameplay or grant the player specific weapons for use in the campaign. The shooting range in the Carrington Institute features unique challenges for every weapon in the game, from handguns to explosives. Each challenge has 3 difficulty levels, requiring more dexterity and expertise from the player in terms of aim and movement as they improve the skills they'll need to beat the campaign on its highest difficulty. Every weapon in the game also has a secondary function for the player to familiarize themselves with for more elaborate gameplay. These extra functions range very wildly, from something as straightforward as the revolver's pistol whip attack, or the Dragon Assault Rifle's function of being thrown on the ground as a proximity explosive. The developers at Rare heavily admired Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation, and wanted to expand upon the stealth mechanics present in GoldenEye 007. As demonstrated in the first level, sometimes the player has to use non-lethal force to incapacitate someone without killing them. To that extent, you can even shoot the guns out of enemy hands to get up close and knock them out. As had become popular in accuracy-focused shooters like GoldenEye 007 and Medal of Honor, enemies are very responsive to which part of their bodies they're shot in. There seems to be an animation for every possible hit, so that the visuals of each firefight don't look repetitive from the same tired death animation. If they're not mortally wounded, but for instance suffered a bad hit to the leg, enemies in Perfect Dark will also limp towards safety or a better position to return fire. I wouldn't say that the enemy AI is necessarily smart, but it is impressive for its era. Enemies will jump, roll, or run out of the way of danger, and if their weapons are shot out of their hands, they'll try to pick it back up or replace it with a weapon already close to their feet. If your foes are close enough to you, they'll even try to disarm Joanna or attack you hand to hand. In terms of its visual presentation, Perfect Dark may have some of the most impressive lighting on this generation of hardware, with lens flares from the sun through glass, or the glare of artificial lights depending on where or how close you stand to the source. I wasn't even aware the Nintendo 64 was capable of lighting and reflections of this caliber. In the Carrington Institute hub world, the marble floor is so clean and bright that the reflections of walls, doors, and furniture can be seen as they're smoothly rendered based on the player's perspective. The contrast of light and dark was actually intended to be a much more significant part of Perfect Dark's experience, as the title might suggest, but this involvement of light levels and the use of a player-held flashlight was all scrapped due to the Nintendo 64's hardware limitations, though that isn't to say that darkness wasn't explored to the fullest of Rare's capabilities. For instance, the third stage of Mission 1 features night vision combat after the enemies knock out the lights. There isn't much indication as to what's going on other than the screen going black, but luckily, players are given a little time to figure things out, as the first enemy, who's behind a door anyway, won't fire their weapon until the player approaches them or fires at them, presumably because they figured out how to activate night vision. Even in the worst case scenario, the lights will be restored after 90 seconds, so the game can continue in the face of player error or confusion. In later levels, players will also have access to X-ray and infrared goggles to change up the way they look at the world around them. Aside from the multitudes of internal locations found in its campaign, such as military bases, alien ships, and even aboard Air Force One, Perfect Dark also features several unique outdoor environments which are most often used as opportunities for sniping. For instance, the second mission takes place at a bright, sunny villa, and drops the player into a tense hostage situation which they have to change the tide of with a sniper rifle. Later on, while being hunted down at a snowy crash site, the player will get a chance to take out their enemies from afar once again in the mountains with stark lighting from a dramatic red sunset, in contrast to the earlier outdoor segments which still presented a very natural and realistic setting. The sniping is still pretty archaic by first-person shooter standards, but featured an impressive degree of zoom on the N64, unimpeded by fog. Aside from the impressive gameplay found in the solo campaign, there are also plenty of additional modes added to Perfect Dark which can be played with 1 to 4 human players, with the rest of their positions being filled by bots. This obviously goes for general deathmatch modes or objective-based split screen, but even the campaign is opened up with very unique multiplayer opportunities rarely afforded to players even in modern games. Once missions are completed in solo or co-op mode, they'll be unlocked for counter-op mode, which is an interesting competitive version of the campaign wherein player 1 controls Joanna as usual, however the second player controls the bodies of various enemy NPCs as they try to stop player 1. Whenever their current grunt soldier is defeated by our higher-powered protagonist, player 2 will jump to another body and continue their mission to stop Joanna. This competitive mode was inspired by 1999's The Matrix, in which agents within the Matrix could swap between various people at will. The counter-op mode does have to be 2 human players, however that's actually not the case for cooperative play. Instead of a screen-sharing human partner, players can actually team up with an AI-controlled ally known as a Perfect Buddy, who will join them on their solo adventures if there isn't a second player around. This cooperative AI partner can still die, so it isn't a free pass to complete more difficult stages altogether, but it still could give players the boost they needed to get through tricky sections. The bot-controlled second player is pretty self-sufficient in combat as well, though they obviously won't take care of any of the more involved objectives, such as those requiring computer hacking or use of the cam spy, leaving the player to work their way through the campaign themselves rather than just coming along for the ride. Perfect Dark is a great example of how rapidly the first-person shooter genre developed, from Doom's gritty, pixelated world of non-stop grunts and gunshots in 1993 to a format capable of telling interesting stories with more thoughtful inputs from the player just a few years later. It's wildly impressive for a game on the N64 to boast cooperative gameplay throughout its entire campaign, but to also allow this second player to be controlled by a bot as a sort of assisted mode for players having difficulty is virtually unheard of in most video games. As if it didn't stand out enough among its contemporaries, Perfect Dark is also one of the earliest first-person shooters, as well as one of the only N64 games at all to feature full voice acting during gameplay, even that of our protagonist, as well as an advisor over radio comms and multiple voice actors for enemy NPCs. Perfect Dark's substantial 45 minutes of cutscenes are also fully voice acted on top of being elaborately animated through motion capture. Altogether, Perfect Dark has a shocking amount of content not just for a Nintendo 64 game, but also a first-person shooter game. Not only is the campaign much longer than you'd expect, especially if you're working your way through the higher difficulties, but the additional solo content, such as the challenge modes and target practice, are actually fun in their own right, rather than acting as an optional training mode. Perfect Dark is also a rare instance of a game able to be enjoyed to its fullest, no matter if it's played by a single player or multiple. Each of these modes, from campaign to split-screen deathmatch, and regardless of player counts between humans and bots, can also be customized with cheats and player preferences for a unique and constantly replayable experience, all while pushing the visual and technical capabilities of the Nintendo 64 to its limits better than almost any other title in the twilight era of the console's lifespan. That is what's so great about Perfect Dark. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a look back at Perfect Dark. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Half-Life, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.